But then when I sit down and read it, I am instantly linked. I'd like you to just talk a little bit about discovering that voice and you know, the creating the Junot of the Rings trilogy.
Yeah, no, thank you. You know, part of this comes from sort of a strategy that you have as a storyteller. I mean, especially, like, guys, if you're trying to do any kind of ideological work, which anyone who's telling stories is, even if they're not doing it consciously, you know, part of telling a story is that you're in some ways pitching an ethos, yeah? I mean, it's the nature that comes out of it, you know? But for me, I tend to be really interested in topics that people have huge resistances to talking about. So I'm really interested in sort of the long-term consequences of rape. You know, I'm interested in sort of what it means to live in the shadow of a dictatorship. Yeah, I'm interested in stuff like how race and racism and self-hatred organize a sexual economy. I mean, we like to think that, like, we just fall in love, but people fall in love in pretty predictable terms along the racial economy. And so I'm interested in all this stuff, but people don't ever want to talk about this shit. I mean, my MIT students, I'll be like, is there any race issues in MIT? And they're like, none. Right? They're like, none. And I'm like, really? Huh? I was like, there seems to be a lot of Asian girls with white dudes. And suddenly it's like the thing that you weren't supposed to say. You're not supposed to talk about this stuff. And suddenly their brains are gripped by this silence. And I think that we have a lot of resistance to talk about things that we observe every day. And so I think part of the work that occurs with Junot's voice isn't simply because you're like looking for a nice voice so that people will read the book. I need something heavy duty to misdirect the reader so that they will read a book about the consequences of rape, the consequences of how we seem to fall in love in ways that Adolf Hitler would be pleased. Yeah. And that also on top of that, that like a lot of us are haunted, deeply haunted by all sorts of both family, personal, and often national histories, which we don't even recognize. And a lot of stuff, people ain't. You bring this shit up, I talk to my students about it, and that's the thing my students can't wait to get off. They're just like, yo, don't talk to me about how everybody I date is lighter skinned than me. I want to do it, I don't want to talk about it. You know, I don't talk about how we all exoticize Asian women in a certain way. We just want to do it. But don't bring it up. And I think part of what happens when you create these sort of books where you're trying to wrestle with these issues is that you need this sort of what we call leisure domain. You need this kind of sleight of hand so that people are lured into the conversation without them even knowing they're in there. And that's the plan. It never works. I'm not kidding. It never works. It's a gesture towards a strategy.
You know, it strikes me that in a sense that you're a horror fiction writer because you're writing about the things that we're scared to even know. It's very Lovecraftian in that sense.
No question. And how often, I mean, first, it's a nice comparison. I'm like, but how accurate it is, I don't know. But sort of as kind of a kind of punning into meaning. Part of what we all do as artists, I mean, the reason, guys, we're in the middle of an election campaign. Y'all notice that neither of our, you know, our possible, you know, oppressors in chief, that neither of them have mentioned an artist? You can go through a whole camp, say?
They brought Clint Eastwood, if you consider him an artist.
Yeah, right. That was Clint Eastwood. That was as close as we come to discussing art.
We're back in the horror genre.
Yeah. Oh, oof. That was like, I don't know about you, but I literally had one of those weird moments where I was watching that, and I was like, did I start smoking crack and never tell myself? Because you're like, what the hell?
Yeah.
So,
it was a Videodrome moment.
My God. So, but, you know, part of the reason this is always happening is because in our culture, the thing with artists is that artists are just fundamentally attracted to the things that no one is trying to deal with. I mean, that's what art's nature is. It immediately goes for a silence, you know, immediately goes for an absence. And so It's not a bad thing to do. It just means you have to have a certain constitution for it, you know? And it's you know, like you said, it's a bit of a horror story for both the artist and for people, because it's not as if like the average artist gets any pleasure at bringing stuff up that other people resist. I mean, for real. Rare is the artist who's like goes to bed thinking, aha, I have been transgressive, I feel great. Usually it costs, you know, it's not just self-validation, it usually costs an artist just as much to break these kind of force fields. But I think those of us who are drawn to being artists, we know this is important. We know that we're in service of a larger cause. So, you know, you do it.
When you're